Okay, so welcome everybody. This is a discussion of Pathwork lecture number 22. It was delivered on January 31st, 1958, and it's titled Salvation. I've seen it as Plan of Salvation. And as I was saying, we've been reading a series of lectures that started with 19 that I call the Pathwork Cosmology lectures. And it's like within this, there's a kind of a story of of the beginnings of creation and why we came to be and how we got where we are, which is a kind of mythological or cosmological kind of story. And, it's also this kind of allegory. So that, if you think about all of these characters in the original story that happened in mythic time, maybe a long time ago, but mythic time is also happening in present time, or it's always happening, right? It's happening in the consciousness. So I find it useful to sort of look at this lecture particularly, but also this whole series of lectures from that kind of perspective. So he says, "Greetings in the name of the Lord. I bring you blessings, my friends. Blessed is this hour." Angels of God always have had the opportunity to speak and manifest to human beings. Many people accept the possibility of manifestation by undeveloped spirits, but deny that communication with more highly developed beings should be possible. So, he's saying here that doesn't make sense, and that really the laws of the universe have to kind of balance out and work alike for good and evil. So, um, if there's this potential for the to be influenced by negative spirits, especially in this earth plane, it's balanced, as part of the story of the, creation, and the establishment of the earth plane as a place of balance where all souls could be influenced by both and free will would remain intact so that they could choose. So he says, there are many ways to test with what spirits we are communicating, and sometimes this is useful and important. He says, anyone who wants to judge must, under all circumstances, take the trouble to study the vast subject. So we want to kind of make sure, and sometimes it's confusing to even really know that in uh, that one lecture where we were talking about half truths and doubt lies and that kind, there's a way that it's kind of sometimes tricky to determine. So if you're a medium, basically, you want to make sure you're channeling, the divine and benign spirits. But we're all channeling spirits in some ways all the time, right? So we're channeling the spirit of peace, or we're channeling the spirit of anger, or we're channeling the spirit of frustration, or we're channeling the spirit of judgment, right? So all of these are spirits, right? And uh, in that sense, it's like we sometimes don't recognize, that we're channeling a spirit that's not so useful in the situation, right? Um, but it's part of our study and our learning, and also, we can't just, like again, we have to recognize it consciously and then make a free will choice. So now he
Hey,
continues.
Darlene, could I
Sure,
ask a
yeah,
quick
go ahead.
question?
Yeah.
And I apologize. I didn't realize I was unmuted before, so for any noise, I apologize. So when you are saying that we're channeling the spirit of frustration or the spirit of anger, how does that relate to our ego state? So our distorted ego state, is that the same thing as a spirit that's
Well, I think
outside
what
of
happens is
ourselves?
that the story, like because the ego has this certain story or understanding, or like the temptation of the spirit of anger or frustration, like kind of knows how to bait us into identifying with it, right? And it usually is, using some story about how, we shouldn't let them get away with it, or if we don't stand up, we'll be weak, or, something, like there's this kind of, and this is with the aggressive spirits, let's say, but, it's just a way of exploring, I don't know how we slice the pie or what's what, really, in some ultimate sense, right? But it's sometimes useful just to think about, like where do our thoughts come from and are they really ours? And, and also the feelings and the tendencies that we have, even though we sort of recognize them as tendencies and therefore it seems sort of more likely identified with them, maybe that also is not really who we are, right? And we bring in these things to learn from them and also um, to make our free choice, like if we channel the spirit of war and we channel the spirit of peace and then we choose between, like what do you really want in the long run? We have to make that free will choice, and it's all about this whole plan of salvation, and everything that happened and unfolded in this section of it, that we're going into, was for the purpose of preserving our free will. And the only way that we can actually, I think, choose and recognize choice is to have these, like experiences of both sides of things. So, did that answer that, Jacob, or I don't know?
Yeah, to a degree. I'm still not fully aware of the connection or the subtle discrepancy between the two, but I'm getting the sense of what you're saying.
I mean, you could, in one sense, you could say, like an ego defense, right? That's like the psychological level. The same thing you call it in a shamanic or a spiritual realm is channeling the spirit of frustration or, aggression or submission or like that. Is that, it's like it's
So
really, I
would
think,
it be equivalent?
I
Like,
think so in many ways. I think it's from a different system, right? And one is more our psychologically based system of understanding things, and the other is more of the shamanic and spiritual and spiritist.
so it's just a different lens, but
I think
it's the
so. Yeah.
same flavor, basically.
That's how I see it, and
Okay.
I think it's always interesting, because we're always delving and learning, and we have to bring it into direct experience to grasp it, I think, fully. But yeah, that's, I would say for me that's often what it is, and I just find looking through different lenses is useful because it brings out and makes aware different parts and things in in a way I hadn't perceived it before.
Mhm. Okay, thank you.
And Jacob, I had the exact same question. So thanks, Darlene. And now I understand a little more.
So he says, last time I spoke about the creation of the earth, how it came into existence, and how humankind gradually evolved. I told you that the earth is a product, or a picture, so to speak, of the longing of the spirits who have fallen and who have lived in darkness for a long time. And I also said that the earth is equally a product of the longing of the spirits who remained in the world of God and who wanted to help their fallen brothers and sisters to come back into the divine light. So thus here on earth, you can find beauty, love, and harmony, as well as the opposite, with all the shades in between. This is the proof that the earth sphere is a product of God's world and the longing of the fallen spirits to reunite with God. On the earth sphere, you have the possibility with your free will to develop and to decide which side to follow. In your own nature, you can and of course, between these two currents, the conscious self stands, able to decide either to take the line of least resistance, which is always man's lower nature, or to follow his higher self, which is the difficult and narrow path. I have also mentioned that communication with the world of spirit has always existed from the beginning of time, when the earth sphere was relatively new. Then it was impossible. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me pause here, back up there. Is there any comment on, this idea that these two, that the earth sphere is kind of this place where there's this 50-50, right? And it's created out of both the connection and the contact with the lower spheres as well as with the higher spheres. And within us, we are also that, it's like, we're that same 50-50. So that feels to me like, and then we can, look to sort of the larger divine nature of reality, right? And our free will choice. And that's what continues to build on the positive. So let me try this again. And so his communication with the world of spirit has always existed from the beginning of time. But at that time, it was impossible for humans to communicate with God's world because there were still too many unpurified currents and attitudes in the soul. So I guess the possibility for that communication and maybe in deep unconscious ways, I still don't quite understand that he said has always existed from the beginning of time, but then he's saying we couldn't really quite communicate. So it seems a little contradictory, but anyway. So
Darlene, something just hit me like a ton of bricks.
okay.
When you just read in the beginning of time, I'm wondering if it means the beginning of like human time, like time, like not measurable time, but the dualistic or like the splitting, because that would have a time component to it, and before things were timeless. Is that what, am I interpreting that correctly?
I mean, I think it can be, also, yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying, and there is like in some ways time is a construct, right? That is created out of a certain level of consciousness, right? That
And that's what
um
I mean. Is it saying that when this level of consciousness began, the beginning of time, meaning the beginning of this level of consciousness?
and it could be he's saying that the Earth's sphere was relatively new at that time, so usually we think of in our science, that consciousness didn't come into existence until like relatively recently. But I think we're being challenged right now in various spheres about how dumb we think everything else is and how unconscious it is when maybe it's not, right? So,
Right.
um, and it could be that in some of this was worked out, and is working out, like in lower spheres, maybe even than in the human sphere. I don't know. But if you go before humans were created, right, which was supposedly only a couple 300,000 years ago, or a million years ago, if you want to go all the way back to the edge of things, right? There's a lot of time, and so I've usually interpreted this as actually, like the whole, what are they saying, 14 billion years of, the actual cosmic, like the creation of our universe, not even just the Earth sphere. And that a lot of the fallen darker spheres were, like prior to the creation of the Earth sphere, which was some 5,000 years ago. And then there was no conscious life on that for, some time, although seemingly sooner and sooner, we're discovering. But even that life, you wouldn't say was dualistic consciousness, right? So it would make it, a different kind of understanding, but it makes sense in terms of it is this type of consciousness that, um, like struggles. And most of the time you look at animals and they seem pretty surrendered, right? And they don't, you wouldn't say that they have free will in some sense. I don't know if that's totally true, but um, so I don't know. That's a big topic, Jacob. Got me going on lots of different levels.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
But I like those, like those sparks of light, because usually when something like that hits us like that, it's very useful just to explore it and, you know, work with it. Because again, it's allegorical, not only necessarily actual, and can speak to something that we're working with. So yeah, so somewhere, even though communication with the spirit world has always existed from the beginning of time when the Earth sphere was relatively new. You got me. I'm not sure when to place that, Jacob. But anyway, at this time, whenever it was impossible for humans to communicate with God's world because there were still too many unpurified currents and attitudes in the soul, too many evil desires, and too much blindness to fulfill the necessary conditions. And so that's why God has always sent beings to the earth who were not fallen spirits. Some of the great prophets and so-called saints belonged in this category. Not only did they bring wisdom, love, and purity with them to leave their mark upon this earth sphere, but because of their nature, they could communicate with angels of God. And so, kind of like one purified spirit here, is kind of amplified and connected, with the larger, realms of light and everything, and so has a more profound effect, than the aspects of darkness. So I should like to tell you what salvation by Jesus Christ really means. Very few people indeed realize its full significance, least of all the organized churches who have almost completely misunderstood what salvation is. Many people believe that Christ died on the cross for the sins of everyone else, and as a result, no one is responsible or accountable for their sins, faults, and weaknesses, for Christ has atoned for them through his death. This, of course, my friends, cannot be so. It would be utterly senseless. After the explanation of the real story of salvation, you will not only see that this is a comfortable misunderstanding, but you will also perceive how this misunderstanding could have come about. I have also mentioned that salvation was not only accomplished on this earth sphere, but in every sphere of existence. I like that. Long before the earth sphere existed, and after the so-called fall of the angels, which I described some time ago in greater detail, God's plan was ultimately that every single one of those fallen beings should have the means to come back to him, back to the light and harmony. But it was essential that God's laws never be broken, not even for the purpose of bringing back the fallen creatures. This was indeed a very difficult task to follow through. I also explained that each being put into creation by God was created perfectly in one way. Each being represented one divine aspect. The purpose was for each spirit to extend this perfection into other realms. Let us say one being was perfect in love, another in wisdom, and so forth. The aim was to use the divine power that we all once had to make ourselves perfect in every other respect, and thus eventually become godlike. So in some ways, incarnation is like, we're like perfecting and building our repertoire and our, capacity. By so doing, additional worlds of beauty would come into existence, spiritual worlds. For as you know, every thought, every feeling, every ambition, every act is formed in spirit and thus creates a world. So any comments there or up to there?
I'll jump in real quick. Can you go back to that paragraph? A little more down, let's see.
A little further back?
No, that's good. Each being represents a divine aspect. The purpose was for each spirit to extend this perfection to the realm. Let us say one is perfect in love, one is perfect in wisdom, and so forth. I'm not clear. Does that mean that's a gift that we have to unfold, or is that just one gift in our journey is to go forward, include all the other gifts that are available too? I'm a little confused by what that means for each person and what they're supposed to do with it.
And I would say here, in some ways, he may be speaking also of the divine beings that he was mentioning just up above, but if it's all beings, that's fine too. But then I think there's gradations, right? But it's kind of reminds me of sort of the Theosophist kind of understanding of divine rays that each of us naturally possess. Like, so we kind of have our main divine ray that is our strength and our spiritual quality. And in our fallen state, that's also been occluded or just, misappropriated in some way or something. But I think what he's saying here is that we are here to develop places that are harder. I struggle with this myself because it is more fun to do the things that you're really good at than develop the things that you're not so good at. And having that kind of discipline, I guess, to do that is like a power that it's been one that I've struggled with, and other people I think too. And for me, I've learned doesn't make sense to just try to make my outer will make my inner will somehow behave. Again, that feels like now we're into this whole thing about free will, right? So I have to kind of convince my free will to choose it, right? To choose the discipline, to choose doing the difficult things, for the purpose of growth. And 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 sometimes maybe it's not even the difficult things, but really just to engage in life, right? And to trust that we're here to bring out what's within us as much as possible and to develop. But I think it is interesting that he talks about, like, that we start out with some aspect of perfection originally, and in some ways creation can help us perfect all of the ways within, so we're, I guess, balanced out in our wisdom and capacity or something. Anybody else want to say something or feel into that one? Or I mean, I like this kind of understanding, and I think it's something that we don't always like live like with very consciously. And I'm getting more and more now into really, like, we live in this quantum field, right? That is really influenced by consciousness, and in some ways, like, we know psychologically our inner dreams are projections, of our psyche. I really am beginning to feel more and more like our outer reality is a similar dream. It's in a slightly more substantial substance in some way, but that it really you know, is created from, from thought, from our attitude, from, the divine vibrations within us, as well as the dark ones, but this is why we're, like, we struggle. So he says, again, by so doing, like, to become more and more godlike, the worlds of beauty that we can bring into existence, right? And so every time we have a benign thought, a thought of love, a thought of connection, of unity, of healing, of compassion, right? All of that, of bringing forth our desires, our goals, our ambition, not in I think a negative sense there, but just like our reaching into life, right? And all of those are acts that are formed in spirit, right? And they really do create realms, not like not just here our own lives, our own life experiences, but certainly that. But he's saying, really creates a world, right? So interesting, just ways of exploring. I'm not saying I understand exactly what these words mean, but I just like to play with, what he's offering here.
Yeah, I like the word you used, realm, instead of creating a world. For some
Mm-hmm.
reason, that's a little bit too abstract for me,
Uh-huh.
you know?
Yeah,
But I
and
mean,
in some ways he used spheres a lot, so I don't know if
yeah,
he's kind of pointing to that same idea. But then when I really look into, like, when I'm in, like, I'm lost in one of my pain bodies, I mean, I really am in a realm. I really am in a world, right? That's very different than my normal waking, conscious world. So in that way, I think it's sort of like making sense. Like, we don't realize how bespelled we are when we're in our defenses and in our reactive places, even when we're quietly doing it, rather than
I'd like to
being.
add, sorry,
Go ahead. Yeah, good.
I just had a thought. I don't know if you guys know who Ram Dass is, but he was a psychologist who turned, who are calling for spirituality. But he did a lot of work with dying people, specifically people who were in pain. And he talks about this, you can get into a realm where you just don't feel any pain. Like the pain is still there, but you can also get into a peaceful state. And that's what
Uh-huh.
he tried doing with people. So that whatever you were just talking about, it reminded me of
Right.
that there are, there are many different worlds that I don't even think we could count. And this is just me going off based on the philosophical reading that I read. But that's what this reminds me of. So
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, and it is, we can kind of contract against the pain of something and like make it harder on ourselves, or we can, kind of like try to relax into, breathe in peace as best as we can. And I'm no one to judge anybody's way of handling pain. I'm not good at it, but it's like I do believe that yes, like it's it's a way that if we don't contract against it, we can actually bear it in a lot more compassion than if it has to be borne, right? So.
yeah. I mean, it also sort of talks about what you just said, you know, that we're, this life actually being a projection, not sort of being a reality. It's quite interesting when you think of things that way. And I just wanted to touch up on thoughts. When you said that, well, the lecture's talking about, where these thoughts originate from. I had a lengthy conversation with Judy today, and I was thinking about it. I'm just sitting here, I'm having these thoughts. I'm like, this is not me, but I just cannot control it, and I want to act. Bitter, anger. People I love, I have like so much anger towards them, and once I sort of just accepted them, let them out, I was like, oh my god, what was I thinking? So that's sort of what reminds me.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, we the guide walks this really interesting line of like sort of not, like not blaming the evil spirits for our stuff, but also understanding that, there's more at play here. And, if we identify with it and forget, the truth, or sometimes we get lost, but the part of that is, like helping us, learn how to transform and heal these pain bodies, right? So they kind of have to knock us unconscious and take us over, but then, we do start waking up and realizing, wait a minute, that's not the truth. Some part of me feels that way maybe, or, because otherwise I wouldn't be channeling this, but it's more than what I am, and it's not the whole truth, and
Yeah.
it's not the most fundamental truth, right? So.
I mean, it's hard once you're in that state. Like, there's no, like today morning, literally, I was telling Judy, like, I started my dream duty, but something was just sitting on my chest. And I'm like, I'm so angry. And then, but yes, with practice, you sort of learn how to control
Right, exactly. Yeah. I'm having a little trouble here. I don't know if other people have that difficulty too, Jasmine. I don't know. Your phone feels a little fuzzy or something. I don't know if there's a way you could adjust how you're speaking into it. I
Yeah,
don't know.
it's
that.
distorting.
Sorry, it's my computer. I don't know why it's making so much noise.
It's much better now. What have
That's
you
Okay.
better,
been doing?
yeah. It may
Okay,
be
perfect.
how close you are to the mic or
Yeah,
something.
I was a little farther away from it, so yeah, sorry about that.
Okay. So anything else here? So he's continuing, he says, you also know that a number of spirits have used their divine power for this purpose, and a number of other spirits have used theirs in an opposite way. And this was the origin of the fall. And after the fall, Christ, who of course existed in spirit world long before he was born as man, organized all the spirits in God's world to use all their strength and perfection in their particular fields to help the plan of salvation. In other words, the pure spirits, instead of continuing and extending their own growing perfection, postponed this ultimate goal for the purpose of using their powers to arrange and to work for the plan of salvation. And this plan exists on every plane. Now, of course, I am still talking of the divine spheres. In the spheres of darkness, some time had to go by before anything could be done. enough spirits had to feel a longing for light before lighter worlds, still in the realm of Lucifer, came into existence. So without this longing, unconscious and blind as it was at the beginning, nothing could change, regardless of what would have been arranged by the world of God. So I think here again, it's sort of invoking that free will, right? And so unless we're seeking, unless there's something in us that's saying there's got to be, a better way, right? Or we're longing for some deeper answers or harmony or love or something. And, so then, the response could happen, to meet that longing. In your language, millions and millions of years went by before, due to this longing, the Earth's sphere gradually came into existence. So again, here it kind of reminds me more of the cosmic, Big Bang and the journey of the whole universe. 14 billion years that, I guess are about, 13.5 anyway. So like in the last 5 billion years, then the Earth came into existence, and then more souls came to live on Earth because they were ready to do so. Low as their development still was, more general and individual development then proceeded. Merely by living on the Earth sphere, they came for the first time after the fall into contact with something divine. Subdued as this was, as this manifestation may have been for the most part. In the meantime, Christ was busy preparing and working in the spirit world of God, planning ahead and sending various pure spirits to live on earth. He also organized teachings for the pure spirits now incarnated to bring to mankind, either through inspiration and guidance or through communication with God's world. At that time, no matter how far human beings developed spiritually, when returning to the beyond, they were still under the dominion of Lucifer. For as I explained last time, every divine aspect was turned into its opposite quality, and therefore free will, which is divine, was turned into domination. And of course, Lucifer would not give up the dominion he held over his followers. If, for instance, a human being, due to a changing attitude and growing harmony with God, would begin to produce light and beautiful spheres in the spirit world, even these spheres still belong to the kingdom of Lucifer because he did not relinquish his power over this person. Furthermore, no one was at that time far enough developed to produce only spheres of light. People would produce and own several spheres, harmonious and disharmonious ones. So, and again, the same, similar to pain bodies or, these different belief structures that create the images. The guide often talks about the image as the foundation of a sphere of consciousness. So this happens incidentally with each one of you and with every human being. Wherever there are faults, weaknesses, and blindnesses, corresponding spheres come into existence. Wherever you are pure and purified, you create beautiful spheres, and you will not only own the best, but also the worst of that which you have built. Any relatively highly developed human being might thus inhabit a number of light spheres, but even these spheres were still under the dominion of Lucifer, as long as the salvation work in this respect was not finished. By the way, what you call hell is not only one sphere of dire darkness and misery. As there are many gradations in the divine sphere, so there are similar gradations in the Luciferic ones. When enough beings were ready and cognizant of God and consciously desired to have complete union with God, the time was ripe for the most important part of the plan of salvation to take place, which Christ took upon himself. He had a reason beyond his infinite love and compassion with all his fallen brothers and sisters. During the process of the fall, the first spirit who fell, Lucifer, developed an intense jealousy of Christ. Thus it was logical that Christ himself should prove his love by his great sacrifice and work, not only to all the other fallen creatures, but also to Lucifer himself, who through Christ's deed alone would one day in the far future find it possible to return to God and thus find ultimate happiness. So let me pause there, even though we're sort of in the middle of a paragraph, because there's a lot there, and I like the again, we're in the story, and it sort of just kind of flows. But is there anything that wants to be commented on in any of that? The whole thing about the free will and the preparation for on the earth plane for Christ's appearance here.
Well, there's a lot of stuff in here, a lot of heavy stuff for me. So I'm still struggling on some level. I can't wrap my brain around who or what is Christ as opposed to God, and who is instead then again who is Jesus, he somehow came into the world to go through the suffering, to face Lucifer. It's still a tangle in my brain trying to wrap it all around there. So I don't know if you want to go into that or not.
Sure, I mean, I can give another shot at it. I mean, but I think the guy does a pretty good job in this. Like, so first of all, he's saying, like in creation, that Christ was the first, like the first creation, right? And that all other beings were made of Christ. So what I understand in Christ is it's a consciousness, it's an energy, it's a vibration. Let's say it's a vibration of love, ultimate love, and he says that, Christ contained most of God's substance, was most like God, right? In that fullness of being that first creation, and then all other creatures and creation, is made out of the substance of Christ. So in some sense, the love is the foundation of the world, this light, this, divine divinity that we are all have within us. We're made of it, we're each sparks of it, right? And then so that the Christ is much bigger than Jesus, or like any of that, and has existed, from the very very beginning. Like it was the second thing, was the next thing after God, or the first creation of God. So does that part seem clear or helpful, or is there a confusion or but?
Well, putting it in an energy form it makes it more clear for me, yes. Although it's still, my little brain can't wrap totally around it. But and then the other thing that bothered me is it said that Lucifer, when he is in existence, when he only existed, even people in the light were still under his power, which again goes against everything I thought was light and dark. So yeah.
So this is the thing that, like again, it's a kind of allegory, right? Of our own consciousness in some ways. But the guide is saying here that there was a spiritual reality, like that happened with the fall, where Lucifer was the first being that, kind of into, like was in control of, like the material realm in some sense, right?
Was he equal to Christ in some way, or
No, and this is where in one of the lectures, it also talks about, there was a kind of jealousy, and he says in this one it developed during the fall, but I think, like, it was almost like like he says the first thought that caused the fall, that was Lucifer's thought, was the justice of God isn't just. So Lucifer is the first thought that caused the fall was God isn't fair, or something's not fair, and if it's God's world, then something's wrong with God's world. I must know better. I'm judging God. I'm like no longer surrendered to God's will the way it is, and so and then there's this kind of competition apparently that did, in this allegorical sense, develop between Christ and Lucifer. What I would say in a way is that Lucifer is egoic consciousness. Can you like kind of, again, we're so used to like these things being, like entities, or mythological creatures and beings, but they're all like they're representations of consciousness. And so this Lucifer means light bearer, right? So it's like there's a lot of brilliance and fiery intelligence in the ego, right? But it's misused, it's twisted and distorted. And one of the ways that it gets distorted is exactly what he's saying here. Like when you think of your own ego, what does it want to do? It wants to control, it wants dominion over yourself and over other people, right? So to me, what this is speaking to is that within us we're half Christ and half Lucifer or whatever, and there's this, aspect of our own nature that, like Lucifer, doesn't want to grant free will, and wants to control things and wants to dominate as a way to have happiness, as a way to, have all of the wonders of the earth sphere, right? The temptations of Christ.
That works for me, thanks.
Okay. So, yeah, anybody else on any of this?
I would also propose that your soul is the egoic manifestation of your spirit. It's the part of you that's separated from unification, the light. It's the part of you that essentially Lucifer captured in terms of his persuasion, so to speak. And it's your soul that's struggling, even in the spirit world, as it struggles here, as your consciousness struggles here on earth.
Yeah,
and somewhere in one of the lectures, I remember someone said, "What's the difference between your soul and your spirit?" And the guide said, "Well, eventually, your soul will dissolve back into your spirit, just as your lower self will dissolve into your higher self, and be one with God." So, it's not like your soul is like this when you go. I don't think it's like this anyway. When you go up to the spirit world, and I don't think your soul is in a peaceful place, even in the spirit world.
It's in, like how I kind of see it, and again, it's based on some of the ways that the guide talks about it. Like, like the idea is we have to be like God. We have to resonate and the frequency of God to be with God, right? And so the parts of us, there is a part of us that is inviolate and still resonates with that. And so I believe that part probably still is with God, but like everything can only be at the level of its vibration. So let's say I die and I still have some piece of unresolved stuff, and resentment or vengeance in my heart or something like that, closed-heartedness about something. Like that part of me, I believe, actually becomes, like the part of the soul substance that then is brought back in the next incarnation to continue to work, and it kind of hangs out in an in-between sphere. I mean, maybe the Catholics call that purgatory, I don't know, but like in this place where its vibration is. So if it's a very negative entity, it's going to be in the lower spheres. If it's a more enlightened but still erroneous understanding, right, it will like hang out. Not a lot changes in the in-between spheres, although there's some things, that can learn and grow. But, those pieces basically have to come back into physical incarnation to be assisted further in transformation and healing. And again, uplifting that vibrational level through free will, through our free will choice, right?
So then the spirit is,
Well, on one level, the spirit is the unified, Holy Spirit, right? And it's like its original like part of the Trinity, right? And its divine aspect. And I think in it's our life force, right? It comes through in our physical, often through our life force, through our basic higher self. We're in touch with it. Um, but yeah, it's like the soul is, I think, mostly what carries all of the different divisions and splits and distortions that it's working through.
Thank you. I'm working with it.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that this is absolute, like this is just how it's come to me and it seems useful, right? And that's what I like about the guide is he says, like, if it's useful, oftentimes, it doesn't have to be the absolute truth. He says we can't quite know or understand fully the absolute truth of it, right? It's like that's why he talks to us in allegories and stories like this. But it is like our Western culture, for some reason, has not, never got schooled very well in mythic consciousness, right? And so I think there's sort of logos and mythos. There's two ways of knowing the world and working through it, and I think we're impoverished because we don't have like a real clear understanding of the way that we can tell these stories that are really referring to energies and psychic states and they're all fairy tales and all of those kinds of old myths and stuff were really stories about these powers and forces of consciousness within us. So I think we get in our Western world we're too literal in some way and we get confused. So I don't exactly know, how it works that, before this battle that, was the reason why Christ came to earth, why it was that, Lucifer held so much power and dominion over us. And I guess, the guy is basically saying since he didn't recognize free will in his domain, free will did not exist in his domain. So no matter what we chose, it didn't matter. Is kind of the best way I can understand that piece. And so, in some ways, we still, up until, Jesus incarnated on earth, like although we were developing and growing into greater light and we were able to be influenced while we were on earth and even in the, others to some degree by the higher spiritual beings, like we could not really maybe that piece of our spirit, for instance, that was still pure was not somehow able to go to God. Um, and they still belong, in all of the things that we created, whether even when they were, loving and beautiful things, they still belonged in the kingdom of Lucifer. Um, and then, most of us, like again, we're creating, different kind of spheres, and so we're never like purely living only in one sphere. I notice myself moving through them quite frequently on different levels. So,
But Darlene, I mean, that's a scenario that's easily understood. It's like, suppose you were a slave and you wanted your freedom. And, your owner said, well, you can want your freedom all you damn please, but you're never going to get it. I own you. This is the same,
yeah.
now.
Yeah, no,
And
yeah, good, yeah. And so that would result that you would understand then, say more, keep going.
well, I mean, of course, fortunately, we live in a time where there's not much slavery, although I'm sure there are still people who want to escape whatever situation they're in. They may live in a country that doesn't make it easy for them to leave. Like, let's say Afghanistan. I bet it's pretty difficult for somebody to get out of Afghanistan right now.
Yeah, and again, I think what, like in some ways, all of the countries, and the physical manifestation of Earth are again like reflections somehow of psychic states, right? That are
Yes.
being, and then we also have, to me, like I think where most of the slavery has gone is now we're enslaved to materialism and to addictions. Like whatever our addictions are now our Luciferic masters and enslavers.
Yeah, sure.
So when enough beings were ready and cognizant of God and consciously desired to have complete union with God, the time was ripe for the most important part of the plan of salvation to take place, which Christ took upon himself. He had a reason beyond his infinite love and compassion for his fallen brothers and sisters. During the process of the fall, the first spirit who fell, Lucifer, developed an intense jealousy of Christ. Thus, it was logical that Christ himself should prove his love by his great sacrifice and work, not only to all the other fallen creatures, but also to Lucifer himself, who through Christ's deed alone would one day in the far future find it possible to return to God and thus find ultimate happiness. God made Christ the king of the universe. And that's partly why Lucifer was jealous, right? Like it's that kind of, I want to be as big as he. And as such, Christ possessed not only the highest privileges, and this is what we don't realize from the ego, right? We want to have all of Christ's privileges, but also the strongest responsibilities. And so that's, where the Luciferic consciousness denies, right? So we again, the infant, the 100 of the child, I want it all my way. I want all perfection for me. And there's no giving, right? So by carrying the heaviest burden alongside his exalted position, he gave another example for the world to follow. Thus, when the time was ripe, Christ faced Lucifer. And now, my friends, I must ask you not to think that all this could not have been that way because it sounds all too human. All you have and know as human beings, not only regarding subjects and objects in abstract and concrete ideas and in language, but also in any sort of forms is only a limited imitation of what exists in spirit before this material world. So again, he's saying that the material world is kind of reflection of much, deeper things in the material or in the spiritual world. And so, even though it's not exactly like, we know it in the physical world that Christ faced Lucifer and they had this conversation, but in many ways, it's the larger, foundation of what any communication is about. And so, again, we have to allow our way of, relating to this through this lens of the story as these two divine beings, powers, forces in the universe, right, are trying to find a way to, um, negotiate this next step. So he says, human beings think when we mention that spirits talk or possess certain objects, that this is too human and too concrete. Yet in spirit, as I have repeatedly said, everything is concrete. Everything is form. In your world, only material objects have form, and the so-called abstract things do not have form, or they are invisible to you. So again, love is a form, right? We don't see love as a form here. We see it as an invisible spiritual kind of thing. So we also can feel it, right? But in the spirit world, it's much more of a concrete reality. And when you have a beautiful thought, it will create one form. And when you have a wicked thought, it will create another form, a concrete form for us, right, in the spirit world. So we don't realize how creative our minds are. I've been working with this guy, Paul Levy, who's working with this kind of collective evil ego thing he calls Watiko, from the Native American story of it. And it's very interesting to look at it from this collective standpoint as well. So, how it kind of is like a virus and passes itself on, and like there is something, that is below our radar. We can't quite see it, but there's definitely forms that are involved here, and when we think of like what we were saying, the spirit of anger coming and we're channeling it or whatever, like, that in spirit world has a certain form that can be, seen as a form, whereas where we are, it's like it's just an energy and a feeling. So I beg you to keep this in mind and not think what I am telling you is childish, because Lucifer and Christ would not talk together like two human beings. It may not be in exactly the same way as when two human beings talk. The procedure may be different. It is a spiritual procedure. This is, of course, impossible to translate into human language. Therefore, the language I have to use must be limited to your understanding. So to continue, Christ would face Lucifer and tell him, "Now there are so and so many spirits who do not wish to remain faithful to you. They desire to go back to God. Therefore, you should set them free." Lucifer would not agree to that. He maintained that he did not recognize divine law and would use his power as he saw fit. So Christ said, in this case, there must be a war between us, between your forces and the forces of the divine world. The chances would be evenly distributed, which means that the divine forces must be numerically in the minority, for the simple reason that the forces of good are infinitely stronger than the forces of evil, perhaps 20-1. If you have one absolutely purified being against 20 very impure beings, the strength of this one pure being would outweigh the strength of the 20 impure ones. Lucifer said, even if such a war took place, and even if the divine forces won and took my power away, I would still not recognize the law of God as being just. As you know from my previous lecture, this issue constituted an essential part of the plan of salvation, since no one should be eternally damned, not even Lucifer himself. And so that no eternal damnation would ever be possible, Lucifer himself would have to admit at all times the absolute justice of the divine laws. Therefore, Christ asked him, in what way would you consider the divine powers to be just? Lucifer answered, I would fight such a war if one being from the world of God would live on earth like a man, without any protection or guidance from the world of God at crucial times, with a great part of his knowledge dimmed out, with matter standing in the way, and would yet remain faithful to God in spite of my temptations and in spite of the most difficult conditions possible. I would offer this person every worldly power and release from all hardship if he forsook God, if he remained faithful to God under such conditions, which I doubt very much. In fact, I say it is impossible. Then I would have my battle with you, and I would recognize God's laws as being utterly just. So, how are you doing with that and following this part of it?
And thus we rewrite,
What?
and thus we rewrite history.
Yeah, so, and so, like, this is kind of uh, this whole reason why this incarnation of, this divine being took place. And didn't have to be, Christ himself, but Christ took it on. And there was not an assurance that Christ would maybe even be able to do it, right? Because the conditions were very, as you can see, what Lucifer put down was, extremely difficult, right? But it's also like what we all face, it's what each of you and I face in some ways, right? It's like he's saying, come down here and see what it's like to be human. And in some ways, the willingness of God to do that, right, and like, again, helps bridge that, between us. And so God understands, God as Christ through Jesus, like, has had the experience of being human and the difficulties and the suffering and the challenges and the temptations that are faced. And so anyway, like, this is where given these conditions, then then the plan continued, so that the incarnation of this divine spirit took place. But he talks about it a little more to give us context. He says, "You must know, my friends, that every living being has at all times guardian spirits from the world of God. But some people's attitude may keep these spirits from coming too close. Nevertheless, they are there, even if only in the background, watching that nothing befalls their protege. That is not according to God's laws of justice, or that the person may be too weak to endure." He's found that very comforting, right? That we're protected from anything that, is truly beyond God's laws of justice, so even when unjust things seem to befall us, we need to question and wonder, maybe there's some justice that we're not understanding in this, but also, this comfort that, also anything that we're too weak for. So we're protected. And to be left alone, then, which was the condition that Lucifer gave, without the support of God's spirit world on this earth sphere, and then in addition having to resist all attacks, challenges, hardships, and temptations that the powers of darkness could think of, seemed indeed an impossible task to fulfill. No human being had ever had to go through anything remotely like it. Therefore, Christ cannot be compared with any other person who has ever lived, no matter how pure or how wonderful the teachings may have been. Christ has shown in deed and in fact what others have taught, and he did it under infinitely more difficult circumstances than anyone else ever had to bear. These were the conditions Lucifer set up for him to recognize God's laws as being just. If this seemingly impossible task were really to be fulfilled, then the battle could take place. And then, should Lucifer lose the battle, Christ could make his terms, and Lucifer would not doubt God's justice in any respect. This then was the plan, and Christ took it upon himself for the above-mentioned reasons, though Lucifer did not specify that it had to be him. Any comments on that? Questions?
Well, it sounds like Lucifer lost then, but he's still around.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting how, he speaks of that at the end of this lecture too. So, because I think there's a little interesting twist in that, because in some sense, he said, okay, like the battle's already been fought. So what are we doing here in this big mess here and now, right? In the midst of the battle. So, but he does even kind of give us an understanding of that. So, uh, he says, if we were looking at scripture from this point of view, we might get a different understanding of them. And he says, I'm quite sure that the reason for the life and death of Christ will now make sense to you. There would not be any sense in Christ dying on the cross for sins others have committed. If you have committed a sin, you yourself have to straighten it out, and no one else can or should do it for you. I love his.
Straighten
If
it
someone
out.
Come
else
to
were
the
to do
point.
it for you, you would not gain purification. You would not receive the strength through the process of self-purification, which alone would protect you from committing sins again. As long as the evil root is not torn out, it must again produce impure fruit. Only you can tear out the roots of your evil. Therefore, that was not the reason Christ suffered and died. You will also understand why Christ was left completely alone for a long time. Naturally, as a man, he did not have the same knowledge he had as a spirit. If he had had that same knowledge, the task would not have been so difficult. He did, of course, possess some knowledge, since he is the highest being in creation. In addition, he had a great deal of spiritual strength and wisdom. However, there would be no purpose to life on earth at all, and this applies to everyone, that if the same spiritual knowledge were available in the flesh as when one is not incarnated. So, Christ, as we do, like we have more wisdom and understanding when we're in spiritual, worlds than when we're incarnated, and we have more limited knowledge here. And so in the same way, the highest spiritual being was somewhat, not aware, maybe somewhat more than most of us, but not a whole lot, that what the purpose was, what was, really trying to happen. So Christ did not know exactly what was involved while he lived on earth. In the course of the years, he received some knowledge. He had a vague idea, just as any one of you might have a vague idea of the task he was to fulfill. Think about that. How many of you have a vague idea of the task you came to fulfill? What may come out of it, how it will end, what the exact meaning is, you will not know, and he did not know that either. He was not supposed to know it while incarnated. After a certain time, even, all the angels of God had to leave him. They were with him for some time of his life, but were not present when the really difficult task began. As I have explained to you, the teachings he brought were important and wonderful, but this was an additional facet of his life. It was a side benefit. Beautiful as the teachings are, they are not new. In essence, other people had also brought the same teachings. He adjusted them according to his times and in consideration of the ever-evolving development of humankind. But that was all. The task was, as I explained, that he, left quite alone and cut off completely from the world of God, had to resist the temptations of Lucifer, who put the greatest effort imaginable into his goal to cause Christ to fall. He used every device possible, and in so doing he organized all his helpers. Believe me, Lucifer is by no means stupid, even though he certainly lacks wisdom and insight. Nor is he without great resources in his own dark powers. On the one side, Christ experienced nothing but suffering, both physical and psychological, as well as humiliation, the extent of which you cannot imagine. The humiliation and psychological suffering were a great deal worse than the physical suffering, as bad as that was. On the other side, he was offered all the temptations of the world of darkness. Of course, Christ was what you would call psychic to the maximum degree. His mediumistic qualities were so strongly developed, not just in one respect, but in every respect, that they were greater than anyone else's before or after. This was an advantage as long as God's world was close to him. But when he was cut off from it, this was merely an additional hardship, for all the manifestations coming to him originated from the world of darkness. Clairvoyantly, he came in contact first with high emissaries from the Luciferic world, and later with Lucifer himself, who made himself appear as a beautiful being, offering Christ all the worldly advantages he might desire, and instant release from all his sufferings, if he accepted Lucifer and gave up his idea of God. Lucifer taunted him in the worst moments of his sufferings. Where is your God of love and justice? If he existed, would he allow his beloved son to go through all of this? If your God cannot offer you more, are you not better off with me? Look what I have to offer you. Your God can only offer you intense suffering and hardship in all possible respects. Can you imagine what this meant? If Jesus had known the exact significance of his task, it would not have been half as difficult to resist. But this was precisely the point. To have doubts at these crucial times, doubts about everything, about his true identity, about there being any wise and good purpose in undergoing all the hardships which he could not understand at the time. In short, about everything he had learned in the previous years. Often he wondered whether he was not under some illusion and whether all his previous knowledge was not the product of imagination. During these times of doubt, Lucifer would instantly be at his side, strengthening such thoughts. It's easy to perceive how extremely hard it must have been for him, being a man and having matter between him and absolute truth, to remain faithful to God and to not give in to these temptations aggravated by hardships. If the conditions of his task had not been such that even Christ might have doubted at times, his task would not have been so infinitely magnificent. Therefore, Christ had to have the same obstacles of matter as all other human beings, but his were intensified to a maximum degree. Material substance is a curtain, and man has to grope to open that curtain. Jesus Christ had to do the same, but in conditions of which you can only vaguely appreciate the extreme difficulty, even with these explanations. To remain on the right path under these circumstances, without fully understanding it, my friends, you cannot really know what it meant. And having the humility, in spite of all the passing thoughts of doubt, to put God above everything, even above his suffering, and above his not understanding why, was the task. It indeed seemed almost impossible that anyone could do it, but Jesus Christ did. By doing this, Christ not only fulfilled the conditions by which the world of darkness could never at any time claim God's laws to be unjust, but at the same time he set an example for everyone born after him. So when you are in suffering and you do not understand why, think of Jesus Christ within the setting of the true story of salvation, and then bring yourself to imagine his sufferings as something real, not some imaginary legend, as real as your own sufferings, only much worse. And then it will be so much easier for you to follow in his footsteps and remain humble, letting God take over. Immediately after Christ had successfully completed his task on the earth's sphere, a number of so-called miracles took place on earth, showing humankind that a major phase in the history of creation was over and an important new phase was to begin. I could talk on for hours and hours about his life on earth, my friends, about his suffering and about his death. But if you read the Bible now, your own imagination can give you a better idea than before of the deep significance and the reality of all of this. Let me pause there and see anything more about, like the understanding of this, this passion that he went through and what it entailed and why he did it. Does it help people understand a little more sort of, and even see yourselves, in his life, right? Or see that, we don't have the same level of suffering, but, in some ways we are each Christ incarnated in this cross of matter, and time. And we each have this same task in some way, thank God to a lesser degree than what was given for Christ. Does that make sense?
Yeah. But for me, it also, it makes him like this great warrior instead of this, nonviolent, peaceful, he just, all of a sudden he's like this great spirit warrior.
But it's like the war, like his shield is love and his sword is forgiveness,
Right.
right?
Right. Which is the opposite of Lucifer, who is basically the original victim of the universe. Right?
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. God's not fair to me.
Right. And he's not fair to all of you other people either. So get on the God's not fair train and let's go for a big old ride together.
I find it hard to believe that, like, if this is a story of a man, right, that had this experience, I find it hard to believe that nobody since him or before him experienced anything as treacherous as that. I'm thinking of Holocaust, and I'm thinking of just people being tortured and being sold into slavery and being sold into, sexual trafficking. I mean, there's just I'm not really sure if I get that, whether it was his level of development that made these internal psychological crises more, or I'm just not sure how to interpret that.
Yeah, no, I get you. I also, like, and it made some, I could never get it when it was just on the physical level, because you're right. Many people have suffered much longer periods of time in the physical plane, with physical, torture or torment or even just illness. So it kind of helped me when he was talking about, two things. One, so imagine that you're the most sensitive being in the world, because that's what when you're mediumistic, that means, you are just highly resonant, like you're very sensitive. You have no ego defenses. You have no, buffer. And so there's, uh, and again, when we're ordinarily here, and we are undefended, we do have our spiritual, protectors, our guardian angels, our, the light beings that are with us. And so, there's two things that I think kind of increase the difficulty for him to the level of his capacity, which I think is true for all of us, right? So this is why I'm saying, we're all Christ going through sort of an equally challenging job given the level of our development, right? And that, and we are all being tempted in the same way, by the material world, by the suffering of the material world, to, abandon God, to, turn to darkness, to turn to material, sources of like addiction, kinds of things, to deal with that sensitivity, and to deny, like something larger, the light in the world, and God, and God here in the world. So we all are definitely tempted in the same way, definitely, suffer on physical and emotional levels. But I think they're saying that, okay, this was the most light filled and sensitive, undefended being in the universe, plus he didn't have any guardian angels with him at the time, and plus the most strongest, of the dark spirits, was intentionally throwing everything he had at him. So I don't know if you've heard of people, in sometimes, ayahuasca ceremonies, or or in other things, actually going into the hell realms, right? So in that way, and even in the story, Christ descends into hell. I think, like on the cross, maybe there was other hell realms, but there's a kind of way that, also the kinds of torments that we're given, are relative to, our issues and unpurified things. And so for Christ, he didn't have any issues or unpurified things, but like somehow all of it was, presented to him, and in a way that, because he didn't understand, right, it was not something easy. But I'm kind of like you. I think, most of us, we're going through our own passion here on earth, and we need to, recognize that we're also, children of God, sons of God, kind of here on this cross of the, space time, right? Like the material realm, which, is always, uh, there's suffering here, right? That's one of Buddha's noble truths, right? It's like we're in the field of time, so there's loss, if nothing else, in suffering. So, yeah, does that help, Jacob, or no?
Yes, it does quite a bit. So yeah, that makes sense from that perspective. Thank you.
So that spirit should have wars, my friend. So now we go. So after the crucifixion, like supposedly, I don't know whether in the Bible, it talks about Christ descending into hell. Maybe this is when the battle was waged, right? With Lucifer. My understanding also is that descent of his light and his love and forgiveness was the first time the fallen spirits in even darker realms had any experience of the light. So like it was like a, a blessing of hope, of possibility, that I think, in that descent, was, uh, brought light into those realms. But I think also in this journey, it's kind of maybe where the battle took place. I'm not quite sure. He says, where do we think our wars come from? So, and this is kind of interesting. We like right now Russia on the border of Ukraine. Like this is only an outpicturing of spiritual war. So, like we can kind of see that like on the Earth plane, like it's almost like in Lord of the Rings, right? There's all these forces playing out. The wizards and the spiritual forces and the earth people trying to do their best to you know keep from having everything destroyed. So he says a spiritual war does not take place in exactly the same manner as a material war on earth, but the essence is nevertheless there. How it happens is again impossible to describe because you lack the perception and understanding, as I lack the full ability to express myself in human language. So I can only describe it in a somewhat condensed way that may sound symbolic and may be symbolic to a certain extent. So a war took place between Christ and Lucifer. You have to use your inner vision and imagine it as though a war with guns or spheres, as on earth, had taken place in exactly that form. Of course, this was not the way it was. However, there was a spiritual war. Again, Lucifer had to admit the justice of the ways of God's world, for as mentioned before, Christ came to fight under equal conditions. It would have been in his power not to take any risks by using greater strength and more helpers. However, he did not, and this was for the same reason that he undertook life on earth, for God's justice to be preserved, even in the eyes of Lucifer. The chances were even, and this was so apparent that not even Lucifer could deny it. That was important, for the plan was and is that Lucifer himself must ultimately come to the point when he too will return to God as the very last of all the fallen creatures, since he was the first to turn away from the laws of God. Jesus Christ fulfilled the plan of salvation in every sphere. His task varied in each of the numerous spheres, because each was different. In the world of God, where the manifold preparations were made, on the earth sphere, and in the world of darkness. After the battle was over, new conditions were set up. They have reigned ever since. So that means that, since 2,000 years ago, basically, right, that there is a different reign on earth. Now, one would have trouble seeing that after, several world wars and all kinds of, like what we're seeing now, this apocalypse, right? Apocalypse means revealing, right? Pulling off the covers, right? So we're having an apocalypse of awareness of all of the darkness on the planet. And yet, in a sense, the battle has already been won, is what this promise is. Um, and in some ways, we're having to make our free will choice, and we're in our own unique battle. But the ultimate collective, or spiritual battle has happened. And so the doors are open, the gates are open for us if we want. So in your history, you will read that on the third day after his descent into hell, Christ went up to heaven. The various details that were preserved in Scripture confirm in a way all this for you, although the time element is not quite exact. Time is always a translation, so to speak, for in spirit, time, if there is such a thing, is individual, psychological, and very different. But this does not matter, for humankind has made a symbol of these 3 days. The new conditions meant that all human beings were given the opportunity to turn to God during their development on earth, going from one life to the other. Lucifer kept all the rights to tempt humans. I like this part too, so like the darkness that we still see here is sort of under the command of Christ there, to, give us our choice, right? And so if we don't have Lucifer there to tempt us, to succumb to our own lower nature, then, like that's kind of the point of choice that we're sort of trying to make. And then if we resist, we would no longer be subjects of the Luciferic world. for the doors were now open to unite with the Creator and inhabit the divine worlds once more. Even the traps and temptations that Lucifer could use were from that time on limited. In accordance with divine law, God's spirit world now has the right to interfere. So this is where prayer can also be, powerful, right? The divine laws must be observed in exactitude. The activities of the powers of darkness are limited and must stand ultimately under the jurisdiction of God. So how does that feel, to hear that? Like, does it touch you at all, or is it all just kind of like too allegorical and mythological? Can you imagine?
Gives a purpose to our presence on the planet. So Lucifer can't override the spirit of God. So that's really reassuring.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of fears, and and I mean, even sometimes like my faith in this, I don't even know, but like there is this beautiful thing that resonates true, somehow, right? And in understanding everything that I've experienced directly of God's laws and the way things work, through all of that, it really does seem that that being is truly a merciful and loving and you know, uh, a being who would like willingly do everything like this, in order to give us the chance to return after the fall, kind of thing, right? And to, definitely, help us now because sort of there's this phase that we're in, and the guide says in other lectures, that kind of we go through phases, and so now it's like the light is coming closer, the union, the sense of separation in some ways is just because we have not felt the presence of the resource very closely because we've been so far out into the, void as he talks about it. So now as the presence of the divine is coming closer and we're beginning to recognize promises, the presences that are there with us, I think it is very reassuring. And hopefully, as we can be reassured, I think we will also become less, crazy stressed out and when like warlike in the world, right? A lot of our warmongering is, in the name of defense. So, as long as we feel like God is our defender, then maybe we can let our arms down a little more. So for Lucifer to still possess a certain amount of freedom is necessary, not only for the now so often explained reason that he must always recognize divine justice. And again, think of Lucifer as the ego, right? But also as a necessary means for development. Evil has to be tasted to the brim in many cases before it can be overcome by free will and the being's own initiative. The desire to overcome must grow through ever mounting enlightenment in each individual soul. And this often is only possible after one has gone through darkness. Right? And so this is where, again, in the 50-50, like when we can embrace and go through and accept the darkness, right, then we begin to realize that it's through the darkness that we found the light. It's the darkness that woke us up in some way, right? And so then even the darkness becomes something that we can embrace as part of God's goodness and part of the plan, part of what was required for us to learn and grow and wake up again. That such enlightenment cannot come in one lifetime goes without saying. To accomplish the perfection that is needed to enter into the kingdom of God, the perfection that was lost through the fall, and to shed all the darkness that has come upon a soul, can never be done in one lifetime. Many, many lives or incarnations are indeed necessary. Life on earth is like a school, where you develop from one class to the other. Sometimes you may stay for a while in one class, and then you may have one or several incarnations in succession where you accomplish a great deal. Human beings who are incarnated from the world of darkness first come with very low and coarse instincts. Only after many incarnations and worked off karmic debts and often after some suffering and a number of divine influences, will the attitude begin to change, slowly but surely. When the senses have begun to refine themselves a little bit, then the real work of self-finding and self-purification begins. And for this phase again, many incarnations accompanied by changing conditions and circumstances are necessary. Even in this secondary phase, many beings have not yet the strength to find God in reality. Too much of the lower self is still present for them not to succumb to the influences of the Luciferic world, whether the influence comes in the form of direct inspiration or through unwitting human instruments. Then it will again take a considerable number of lives to awaken sufficiently to strengthen one's willpower for the all-important process of self-purification. Only then will a further phase come in which the process of very gradual purification begins. In each life, conditions are prepared so that a certain side of the lower self has the opportunity to transform itself best. So again, what are we here for? Usually there's some piece of the lower self that we bring in, right, to work on. And we create for it the opportunities to get activated and then to transform it. You see, it cannot be any other way, for it would be impossible to reach in one lifetime the necessary perfection needed to enter the kingdom of God for always. With each life, even in the worst cases, something is gained, even if the benefits can only be fully experienced at a later period when a being finally declares, "My path leads to God, and I will not listen to my lower self." That self which is constantly and magnetically in touch with the world of darkness. The higher self, which is much further in the background and much more difficult to reach through all the layers of imperfection, is, however, in constant contact with the divine world. The outer personality, with its willpower and capability to decide one way or another, has the means one day to make the decisive step. I declare myself for God, for my higher self, with everything that it entails, disregarding the laziness, the comfort, and the ways of least resistance to give in to one's faults. Whether the faults are still murder, stealing, wickedness, or are now only selfishness, jealousy, envy, resentment, laziness, or whatever else, makes no difference in principle. Anyone truly declaring and deciding and remaining with the decision to follow the path to God, hence the salvation of Christ, cannot remain a subject of the Luciferic world. Lucifer will have no power over such a being, whether on earth or in the spirit world. This is the way Christ has opened the door. You may now understand why it is said that Christ saved you from your sins. This is accurate only in the sense that your great sin of falling, of not remaining faithful to God, and of becoming at one time part of the world of darkness, does not have as a consequence eternal exclusion from the divine worlds. From this, Christ has indeed saved you, and for this you certainly have all the reason in the world to be grateful to him. Through him, you now have the possibility, by your own efforts and development, to cross the threshold. In that sense, it is correct to say that Christ died for your sins. However, the interpretation that Christ died for all your sins and all your faults is very wrong. This, then, very briefly, is the story of the creation of the universe, the fall, the creation of this earth sphere, and the salvation through Jesus Christ. At the beginning of this series, I encourage you and my friends to ask all the questions you have in mind about this subject that have not been answered in these lectures. I would like to suggest that you think about what I have told you, reread my words since you miss so much when you just hear the lecture for the first time, and then prepare your questions. So it might be that there's a Q&A I'll look into afterwards that we can look at next time. But yeah, so be blessed, my dear ones. Be in God and be in Christ. So I was kind of going back to, the thing that you were saying, Jacob, too. I think about, aren't there other beings also that brought light or suffered, in this way? And I think it is, always, like other beings have come on to, come in before Christ, it's like, and maybe in some ways it's an ongoing allegory, and again it's happening like the guide is saying through all of this time, and although this event was one event in history, there's even some question whether it was actually a historic event, like even some Christian sects don't believe that, but it was a spiritual event in some sense. So but I find that to just see this understanding of the great treasure of free will, and the efforts of love, in spite of our faults and imperfections. If we can remember this, and really hold our own dignity, not feel some sense of shame in the face of the divine, because I think that's a part of what keeps us locked in darkness and in our own struggles, is we still in our own self don't feel worthy to receive this help and this love and this resource from God. And then we often don't ask. And of course, since we have free will, we're sort of on our own. So, in one sense, I hope that as we, take this on a little more, like we can just open to the possibility of this, the spirit world that can help us, and that we aren't alone, and that, all of this, has a deep purpose, like that we are each working through this own purification, and becoming God, right? Becoming more and more like God. So, and my feeling is, well, not only maybe that gives us the possibility then that we can go, rest at God's feet eternally and never have to incarnate again. And that may be, who knows, what I decide in time eventually or something. But for me, it also goes the other way. It means that if we can truly embody this wisdom, and, choose, our own higher self over the temptations of Lucifer, we can choose our own inner Christ consciousness and live through that here on earth. And then we can incarnate, millions of Christs on the planet. Think what we could do, right? Think of the love and the beauty and the possibility and the creation that maybe, the universe, will eventually come back into, nothingness or just the spiritual level. But it could also be that this plan of creation, and everything that's happened, might lead into even greater adventures for us all, and more and more light into the cosmos, in a way that just creates more beauty everywhere, right? For ourselves and for each other. So for me, some of the work that we do, is for all of us and for the whole plan. We are all each also, working and doing our best to be uh, parts of the armies, the energies of the divine and of the plan of salvation. And even when we're struggling with our own lower self, the fact that we're conscious of it, and we're seeking a deeper truth, and seeking to sacrifice our own maybe selfish, addicted desires or something, for a greater love, greater union with others, that kind of thing. We're basically, here, and doing this battle, doing this work. And we should realize and honor and recognize the beauty of this, that we came. We chose to be here, we chose to give this, we chose to go through this from our deepest inner heart, from our deepest love for God and creation. That's why we're here. And yes, we don't remember all of that, and sometimes we don't feel that love, and we don't believe even that God is here. But deep within us, in our spirit, in our deeper knowing, that's where we're coming from. And God knows us there. So I hope everybody, can take something of use out of this. Any final comments, or anybody else wanting to chime in here?
That was really great, Darlene. Thank you.
Very welcome.
Very insightful and very helpful. Thanks, Charlie.
Yeah.
I have to say, there's a part of me that's like really sad about the fact that the doctrines of Christianity completely missed the part about incarnations and reincarnations, and the process of the soul's journey, actually, and just jumped right ahead to the like, okay, believe in Jesus and you're saved. It's like they missed the most important part of the equation, and I just wonder how that could possibly be.
Hey, you may enjoy, I don't know, Frank. I mean, there's interesting, maybe even Judy can, I don't know, there's like a really interesting study of church history and of European history, like, going back through and many developments, in the Catholic Church and ways that, things were interpreted and looked at and codified. And if I remember right, there was other references, in other of the Gnostic books that were not included in the Bible that referred to, more like reincarnation and that kind of thing. And I think there's one statement of Jesus in the Bible, something like before Abraham I was or something, and like, or something like, and people I think that he the man Jesus, not incarnated in the full Christ, but was incarnated in other figures in the Bible. So there's just interesting philosophies or speculations on all of that. But it is like, I think a large part of the Luciferic consciousness like influencing, and so to limit it to one life again is dominion and control
I can't
over.
help but wonder how much further along we would be on this if everyone
I
believed.
think it's always just the forces. I mean, even in the cultures that include reincarnation, it's like there are mystical understandings of that among their people, right? And some people have that, but there's also these kind of you know like less conscious ways, and so people are just like looking at karma as a kind of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth,
Mm,
sort of thing, and it's not as deep, and it's kind of more like punishment rather than education, stuff like that. So Lucifer, I think, again, that consciousness again distorts what the truth is in
mm.
almost all spiritual traditions, and kind of uses it in a way to confuse things and half truths and make us miss the whole thing. And so, yeah, I think we might have been, but I think this is, it is what it is, and I think it's just the stage of humanity at this point, and we can't skip over it or
Yeah, I also couldn't
faster.
help it. I also couldn't help but find the analogy, and of course, going back to the fall, the lecture about the fall and how Lucifer was essentially jealous and like I said, the original victim of the universe, and probably used victimhood as his most persuasive argument. And look at what happened with old Donald Trump and his little victimhood plan. He convinced so many people that they were victims in some way, you
Yeah.
know?
The fall is ongoing, and this is also this guy Paul Levy in his Watiko thing. He talks about this very same thing and how it's very contagious and it's very seductive, and it's like all of these things, and we are like right now. I mean, between the population pressures and all of that's going on, like the infectious nature of this negative force, it's trying to, like, as the light's trying to unify us, it's trying to like separate us and drive
Yeah,
us apart, and so, yeah, and everybody in a way is subject to being infected, and we're all like already infected by Watiko, and then depending on, our consciousness around that, like we can be completely sort of like, somebody coughing on me, then, like it's very virulent, and all of a sudden everybody's contagious and everybody's, reacting eye for an eye, tit for tat, like ego versus ego kind of, fights and stuff, just like Trump. And and he clearly, I would say was a major channeler, of that Watiko, or evil spirit, the Luciferic consciousness. In the guide's lecture, it's the Luciferic consciousness is the evil personification of separation. uh, I think it's the materialism, right? And there is no God, right? It's all just matter, and we want to get ours before we die and have the best time we can. Who cares about anybody else? And then the third one is the personification of the half truths and the lies, which also, are like were used a lot by Donald Trump, and also the media and everything, is like sort of spun even by the corporations and everybody. It's all a big game of half truths and lies. So we're all definitely being, channelers of Watiko, or all of this evil in the world. And I think it helps to just try to realize like it's an infection. And so instead of pointing fingers of blame necessarily, we like recognize we're all subject. And so what we want to do is try to strengthen our immunity and try not to pass it on in our own self, right? And exacerbate it, like to be in this battle of love. We're trying to, calm the war and bring the peace. And so that's within ourselves. When we get triggered by some, person that just, coughed Watiko all over us, and we want to punch him right in the mouth back, or, whether it's, you know, in the war, with Russia and all of that. I don't know the answers to any of these things. I mean, I just kind of scratch my head when I watch this all being played out on the world stage. But Paul's theory about Watiko is very much to begin, and I think the guide is saying this too. And it's hard for us to do that, but we really, if we take on our total, every bit of our experience as all projection, it's all dream. And whatever we're experiencing, if we can be awake in the dream, we have some choices. If we're not awake in the dream, if we're responding to our conditioning and our defenses and our reactions and all of that, so a part of it is like to direct it out. We're just in a dream, and if I can, get lucid, wake up inside that dream, then I can have some free will choice. But until then, we're sort of under the command of our, the dominion of the habit of the Luciferic state. Okay. Well, it's about 9:30, so anything else for anybody? It's good to see everybody. Nice discussion. Hope.
Thank you, darling.
Thank
Yes,
you,
thank you,
darling.
Darlene. Have a
Yeah,
good night, everyone.
thanks.
Thanks,
Good
Julie.
night.
Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.